You need shelter, and I need a father to teach my children the value of hard work. Come with me." This was the shocking proposal Clara Ara, a widow struggling to raise her 3 children alone, made to a complete stranger on the side of the road. She was on her own journey of starting over, fleeing from debt and mourning the death of her husband. The man, Joa, was nothing more than a drifter in tattered clothes and a lost look in his eyes with nothing to offer. But Clara saw something different. Where the world saw a failure, she saw a need. He needed a roof over his head. She needed a father figure for her boys. In a gesture of faith or desperation, she invited him onto her wagon. And as they rode off into the unknown, she prayed silently, not knowing whether she had just saved her family or brought a curse into her home. Joe had been walking for days. The sun scorched his face, dust clung to his skin, and every step felt like it might be his last. He no longer knew if he kept going out of will or sheer stubbornness. He had once been a farmhand on a cotton plantation, a man with steady hands and a simple life, until a fire destroyed everything he called home. The flames took the cattle, the barn, and his dreams. When the fire died down, only guilt remained, the feeling that he could have done more. The landowner had died trying to save the animals, and from that day on, Joe never slept peacefully again. He lost his job, his home, and the respect of others. In the village, they said he was unlucky. That misfortune followed wherever he went. And so, with shame greater than his hunger, he left without a destination. He slept under trees, drank from streams, and spoke to himself, begging God to let him vanish without pain. But God sometimes has different plans than ours. Was about to cross paths with Clarice. When he climbed onto the wagon, his hands trembled. He looked at the 3 boys and felt the same fear one has in front of a family that isn't their own. Fear of not deserving the space, of not knowing how to act. Clara, noticing this, broke the silence. "What's your name?" "Baptista." "A name of faith," she said. "The road punishes, but it also teaches." He lowered his head, ashamed. It had been so long since he'd heard words of respect that he felt small in the face of her kindness. The boys stared at him with curiosity, and the oldest, Samuel, asked, "Do you have any children, sir?" Joa took a moment to answer. The memory was heavy. "I had a little girl. She passed away when she was still very young, before her mother left too." Clara fell silent. There was nothing to say in the face of such loss. She just looked toward the horizon and tightened the reins. The sound of the wheels blended with the distant song of cicadas along the way. Joa watched Clara Ara's movements, the firm way she held the reins, how she comforted little Ellis when he cried, the look of someone who had faced more than she ever should have. It unsettled him. There was a quiet strength in her, the kind women have when they don't seek applause, only peace. When they reached a flatter stretch of road, Clara Ara spoke, without looking at him. "Jew, I can't promise you much. The small holding I have is tiny, but there's land to plant and a barn that's still standing. I only ask one thing. Treat my boys with the same respect you would have wanted for your daughter." Joe swallowed hard. "Miss Clara Ara, I have nothing, not even decent clothes or a bed. But what little I know, I learned through sweat. If you give me a place, I'll work from sunrise to sunset." "The place I've already given," she replied. "The rest life will take care of." Dot. Silence, the kind that doesn't weigh down, but embraces. That moment hung in the air like a promise that didn't yet know it would be fulfilled. Further on, when the sky had darkened completely, Clara pointed to an old rusted gate. "There it is, our new beginning." Dot Joe climbed down from the wagon, looked around, and smelled the scent of damp earth, wild grass, and hope. It wasn't much, but it was land, and for someone who came from nothing, land was already a blessing. That night, he slept in the barn on dry straw and beneath the sound of the wind hitting the roof. Before closing his eyes, he whispered a short prayer, almost a breath. "Lord, if this is punishment, let it be light. But if it's a new beginning, let me be worthy." Outside, Clara turned off the lamp on the porch. In the dark, she too was praying, and without realizing it, two wounded souls, one by loss, the other by guilt, found shelter under the same roof. Dawn had barely broken when Clara awoke to the distant crowing of roosters. Fog blanketed the valley, and the morning chill crept in through the cracks of the house. The roof dripped in places, and the wind made the windows groan. Still, there was a new scent in the air, a mix of damp earth, hope, and beginnings. The boys were still asleep, curled up beneath thin blankets. Clara got up slowly, lit the wood-burning stove, and set the last portion of coffee she had to boil. Joe, who had spent the night in the barn, was already up. His face was marked by sleep, but his eyes were alert, like someone who had found purpose again. He was cleaning up straw and organizing the little he had brought, a handleless hoe, a worn pair of sandals, and a rosary hanging from his neck. When Clara Ara appeared at the door, apron tied and scarf covering her hair, he straightened up, unsure if he should speak or just say thank you. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, offering him a mug of hot coffee. "I did." "It was the first roof I've had over my head in months," he replied, eyes to the ground. "Around here, no one asks what you lost, Jew, only what you plan to build." He looked up. Those words fell on him like a blessing. Clara didn't see him as a beggar, but as someone who could still be useful, worthy. It stirred something deep inside him. Soon after, the boys woke up. Samuel, the eldest, came out first, cautious, watching Joe's every move. Pedro followed, curious, carrying little Elias in his arms. The three of them stood at the barn door, observing the stranger. The youngest, with the innocence only children have, was the first to speak. "Do you know how to fix wagon wheels, sir?" Joe smiled for the first time since arriving. "I do, kid. I've fixed plenty." "Then you can stay," Elias replied, matter-of-factly, before running back to the house. Clara Ara heard the exchange and smiled too. Sometimes children say what adults are afraid to admit. Joa was already part of the household, even if he didn't realize it yet. The day unfolded in the quiet rhythm of work. Joe fixed the pasture gate that had been falling for months. He cleaned the well, cleared out debris, chopped firewood, and mended fences. By late afternoon, his hands were covered in blisters, but his heart was full of peace. Clara watched from a distance. Silently, there was something in him that time hadn't managed to steal the will to start over. At sunset, she called him in for dinner. They all sat at the table, simple old wood, mismatched plates, and lantern light. The smell of beans and toasted flour filled the air. Joey slowly, as someone who respects the food they're given. The boys told stories, laughed, fought over pieces of bread. Clara, quiet, watched it all unfold, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Presence. The house once again had voices, footsteps, life. After dinner, she stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the moon lit up the yard. Joel followed quietly, not wanting to intrude. "Miss Clara, may I ask you something?" he said shilly. "You may. Why did you help me?" She took a moment before answering. "Because once someone gave me shelter, too, and if I had let fear decide back then, my children might not have a roof today." Joe nodded, moved. The wind rustled the mango trees, and the silence between them was rich with meaning. Clara looked out to the horizon and added, "It wasn't the house that took you in, Joe. It was life." He lowered his head and smiled, eyes welling up. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a man again, not a burden, but a part of something greater. That night, the sky seemed closer. The old small holding, which had long stood as a symbol of abandonment, began to breathe again, and without anyone realizing, destiny had already begun to stitch together, within those simple walls, the story of a family the world had forgotten. The next morning, the sun rose strong over the yard, lighting the broken roof tiles and the cracked ground around the house. Clara Ara was up early as always, and even before the rooster crowed, she was already sweeping the porch and heating water on the wood-burning stove. the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of damp earth. Outside, Joa was organizing the tools, studying every detail of the small holding like someone examining a wounded body. Everything needed fixing. The gate sagged, the fences were broken, the well was half clogged, and the corral was nearly falling apart. Still, there was hope in every piece of that ruin. Clara stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Joe, don't wear yourself out more than you need to. Whatever gets done today is enough." He looked up, sweating. "Miss Clara, when we work to rebuild a home, tiredness feels like a blessing." And that was how the first day of rebuilding began. Joa worked from sun up to sundown. He cut wood, nailed boards, and cleaned the well until the water sparkled again. He fixed the gate and crafted a new lock from scraps of iron he found in the yard. Clara Ara watched him from a distance, surprised by his dedication. There was something sacred and quiet in each of his movements, as if with every wall he raised, he was also rebuilding his own soul. The boys, curious, followed him everywhere. Samuel held the hammer. Pedro carried the fence posts, and little Elas proudly kept the nails in his pockets. By the time the sun began to set, the gate was sturdy, and the fence stood tall. Ju looked at the finished work and gave a small smile. "It's not pretty, but it's standing. And if it's standing, it's alive." Clara Ara walked over with a basin of water and a clean cloth. For just one day, that's already a miracle. He washed his face, and the water that ran off carried away dust, sweat, and a bit of long-held pain. In the afternoon, Clara called him to eat. They sat under the shade of the ipo tree. The boys played near the well. The air was still, and the sound of birds seemed to stitch the silence together gently. "Your husband worked in construction too, didn't he?" Joe asked carefully. "He did. A good bricklayer with steady hands died in a collapse. Got caught under the very weight that held up other people's dreams." Joe looked down. "Sometimes those who lift up what belongs to others forget to care for themselves." "That's true," she said, gazing at the horizon. "But what I have left is this land, children, and faith." "And now you," he was speechless. Since losing everything, no one had included him in anything. "You" was just a way of speaking, but in her words, there was something more. Recognition that in the days that followed, the work continued. Jiwang replaced roof chilies, repaired the stove, fixed the windows. At night, Clara Ara lit the oil lamp and mended torn clothes while he sharpened tools on the porch. It was a simple routine, but a living one within that simplicity. Something invisible was growing. Respect, trust, the kind of affection that blooms slowly without fuss. One night, strong winds brought sudden rain. The roof held firm. Clara looked up and smiled for the first time in years. There were no leaks over the boys' beds. Ju heard her laugh and felt his heart warm. When the rain passed, he stepped out into the yard and looked up at the sky. The stars were shining and the air smelled of wet earth. He whispered a short prayer of gratitude. Clara Ara, standing at the door, watched him in silence. "You know, Joe," she said softly, "it's been a long time since I've seen a man fix things without complaining." He turned to her, humble. "It's just that when you have nothing, Miss Clara, learning to fix things is the same as learning to live." She smiled. Life there was slowly returning. The house was no longer a ruin. It was becoming a home. What had once been silence was now filled with the sounds of work, the smell of bread, and the warmth of a faith being reborn in the heart of someone who had never truly stopped believing. The news spread faster than the wind. It only took one neighbor seeing Clara Ara's wagon arriving with a strange man for the village tongues to start wagging. The widow brought a stranger into her home, a man who sleeps in her barn and eats her bread. That kind of thing ruins a woman's name. In the taverns, at the markets, in the well queues, Clara Ara's name became a subject of whispers and judgment. And as always, the ones who talk the most are the ones who know the least. Clara Ara, however, kept on with her work. Early each morning she milked the cow, swept the yard, taught Elias his first letters, and cooked the beans Ju brought from the field. Her gaze remained calm, like someone who had already learned that dignity is defended with silence. But inside, it hurt. It hurt to see neighbors who once greeted her, now crossing the street. It hurt to hear from afar the laughter of women calling her a fool for sheltering a lost man. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, Donna Milena, one of the village's biggest gossips, approached with a voice that blended curiosity and venom. "Clara, I heard that man is still living here. Is that true?" "It is. And you're not afraid of what people will say." Clara Ara didn't even lift her head. She just replied with the calm of someone who carries simple truths. People who talk about someone else's blessings have likely never known hunger. Donna Molina fell silent, caught off guard. She walked away with the face of someone who came looking for gossip and left with a lesson. But Joe had overheard part of the conversation. That night, sitting on the barn's doorstep, he fell into thought. The old weight of guilt returned. The memory of the fire, the dead landowner, the voices that called him cursed. He feared becoming ashamed once again. Now in the very house that had taken him in. When Clara came out to gather the laundry, he spoke softly. "Miss Clara, maybe I should leave. I don't want to stay in your name." She stopped holding the basket in her hands and looked at him as if seeing straight into his heart. "Leave? Why? They're talking about me, about us, saying it's shameful, that it's not right." Clara Ara set the basket on the ground and stepped closer. "Joe, I'm not afraid of people. I'm afraid of my boys going hungry, of faith running dry in my home. The rest God will take care of." He said nothing. Her words were firm, but full of tenderness. There was a kind of bravery in her he had never seen before, the courage to stay when the world expects you to run. In the days that followed, Joel worked twice as hard as if trying to earn through effort his right to stay, and the boys began to admire him even more. Samuel learned to measure wood. Pedro practiced using the hammer, and Elias, ever curious, kept asking questions. Laughter returned to the house, but in the village, so did the murmurs. One Sunday, Clara Ara went to church with her sons. Upon arriving, she felt the cold stares of a few women. She sat in the back in silence. During the sermon, the priest spoke of charity, that God doesn't choose the pure, but the willing. Clara Ara listened and took a deep breath. In that moment she understood. God's justice is not made of words, but actions. When she returned home, she found Joping the yard. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over his gray-streaked hair, and his calloused hands shimmered with sweat. Clara stopped for a moment, watching that simple, truthful scene. "Ju, if you leave, who's going to teach my boys how to be real men?" she said, breaking the silence. He turned slowly, his face tired, but his eyes steady. "Then I'll stay." Clara smiled, and for the first time he felt that his choice to stay wasn't just an act of gratitude. It was a silent vow of belonging. That night, the people of the village slept peacefully with their tired tongues. But inside that house of earth, in hope, something was being born, something that needed no explanation. The quiet strength of a love that hadn't yet been called love. Cla and Juan, brought together by need and by faith, were beginning to understand that sometimes destiny disguises itself as scandal before revealing itself as a miracle. The days that followed carried the sweet scent to freshly turned earth. Ju rose before the sun and called the boys out to the fields. Samuel, the oldest, came along reluctantly, still half asleep. Pedro arrived laughing, always curious, and little Elias ran barefoot, trying to keep up with his brother's pace. Clara watched them from the porch as the four made their way toward the farmland. Dew still sparkled on the leaves, and the morning chills seemed to bless this new chapter. Joe, like someone, sang a prayer. He showed the boys how to hold the hoe, how to measure their strength without wasting effort, and how sweat was the fair price of abundance. "Work isn't punishment, boys. It's the way God teaches patience," he'd say firmly. As the sun climbed the sky, one day Samuel, ever skeptical, asked, "Do you think we'll be poor forever?" Joe stopped what he was doing, wiped his face with a cloth, and replied, "Poor is the one who learns nothing from life. Samuel, you're learning to plant. That's worth more than any coin." The words echoed in the boy's heart. Since his father's death, he had carried the fear of not knowing how to become a man. But now he saw a different kind of example in Joe. A man who didn't command, but guided, who didn't shout, but taught Dot at night. When they returned, Clara Ara always had dinner ready. The house smelled of firewood and beans. After eating, they would sit together on the porch. Joe would tell stories from the countryside of heavy rains that wiped out crops, of harvests that saved entire families. The boys listened, and Clara, sewing by lamplight, smiled quietly. Laughter blended with the sound of crickets, and what had once been a quiet house was slowly becoming a lively home. One afternoon, Joe took the boys to the river. He showed them how to cast the line, how to respect the rhythm of the water. The fish comes when it wants. It's rushing that scares it off, he said patiently. Don Pedro, ever in a hurry, cast his line constantly. Elias, still little, asked endless questions, and Samuel, for the first time, began to understand the value of silence. While they waited for a fish to bite, Joe shared a piece of his past he'd kept hidden. "I used to work on a big farm, had a boss, a good house, steady pay, thought that was safety. Then one day, fire took it all. That's when I learned what we have can vanish, but what we learn stays." Samuel looked at him with respect. Pedro, not quite understanding, asked, "And weren't you mad at God?" Joe replied calmly. "Mad? No, we might cry. Sure, but if we shut our hearts, life doesn't come in anymore." On the way home, the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky orange. Elias held Ju's hand with a kind of trust only children know. And when Clara saw the five of them returning down the road, her chest filled with something warm. That man who had arrived as a drifter was now part of the routine, the home, and their memories. Later, with the boys asleep, Clara Ara and Joe sat on the porch. The wind stirred the leaves of the IPA tree, and the silence between them tasted like gratitude. "They're learning fast," she said. "They're good boys. They just need to see a good example," he replied. "And do you think they have one?" she asked, half-dashed, laughing. Joe looked at her seriously and answered, "They do. They have a mother who never gave up." Clara Ara lowered her eyes. No compliment ever moved her quite like that. Respect. That was the kind of love she knew how to recognize. Before heading inside, she paused and looked up at the starry sky. She thought of Wim, her late husband, and felt somehow that he too was smiling from above. Life moved forward, and God, in his quiet justice, was slowly rebuilding what fate had broken. That night, the house slept peacefully, and under that simple roof, love, still unnamed, still quiet, grew with the same strength as the seeds Ju had planted in the soil. Nights at the farm were peaceful, but inside Ju there were still fires time had not extinguished. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Clara would hear heavy footsteps coming from the barn, the sound of someone waking abruptly, breathing deeply, as if trying to escape an old nightmare. She would rise quietly, light the oil lamp, and find him sitting on the wooden bench, eyes fixed on the ground, his face covered in sweat. "The fire again?" she'd ask softly. He would only nod, too weary to speak. Du carried that memory as one carries a cross. The fire that destroyed the farm had also taken the life of his employer, a good man whom Joe had respected like a father. Though everyone said there was nothing he could have done, he still blamed himself for not saving him. Since that day, he'd believed misfortune followed him, that his presence brought bad luck. One night, Clara brought him a blanket and sat beside him. "You know, Joe," she began, eyes on the floor, "I dream of the past, too. Sometimes I see my husband's face, covered in dust, calling for me just before the wall came down. I wake up drenched in sweat, not knowing whether to pray or scream." Joe Bow turned slowly, surprised by her confession. "And what do you do after?" "I pray, but not to forget. I pray to endure the remembering." Those words pierced Ju's heart. No one had ever spoken to him with such truth. The silence that followed was broken only by the crickets and the sighing of the wind. In the days that followed, Clara noticed he spoke more. At the table, he began telling small stories from the time he still had work, about the daughter he'd lost as a baby, and the woman who had left when poverty came. He spoke calmly, without bitterness, but with the weight of someone who still hadn't forgiven himself. The boys listened, not fully understanding, but filled with respect. Samuel, the oldest, paid attention to the way Jew spoke of work, life, and duty. It felt like hearing a father again, even if the name was different. One afternoon, while tending the chicken coop, Jew suddenly felt dizzy. His body weakened, and he sat down, breathless. Clara ran to him, holding him by the shoulders. "Are you all right?" "Just tired," he said, trying to hide it. She pressed gently. "It's not your body that's heavy, Joe. It's what your heart carries." He took a deep breath and murmured, "It's hard to forget what the fire took." Clara met his eyes, steady and certain. "Fire burns what's outside, but what's inside only God can cleanse." Dot. In that moment, something shifted within him. For the first time, he realized he didn't need to erase the memories to move on, only to accept that they too were part of the road. That same night after dinner, Clara placed an extra plate on the table. "So, you can eat well, Joe. Tomorrow will be a long day." He looked at the simple, full plate and felt his eyes filled with tears. "It's been a long time since anyone cared whether I ate or not." Clara Ara simply replied, "No one lives alone here." From that day on, the barn stopped being a refuge for a sad man and became part of the home. Joe began to sleep better, and the nights grew calmer. The sound of bad dreams slowly gave way to the crowing of roosters at dawn. Dot. One evening, as the sun sank behind the Say mountains, Clara Ara saw Joe sitting on the porch, gazing at the horizon. He seemed like a different man, his hands still calloused, his face still lined, but his eyes, oh, his eyes no longer belonged to someone defeated. She came closer and asked, "Thinking about the past?" "No. Thinking that maybe I still have a future." Clara Ara smiled, rested her hand on his shoulder, and replied, "Everyone does. You just need to find a place where pain can rest." And there, beneath the same roof that had once sheltered a stranger, two wounded souls began to understand that forgiveness is the greatest work a heart can ever learn to do. The first bean blossoms began to appear just as the cold gave way to the warm breeze of the new season. The farm, once quiet and worn out, now pulsed with life. The crowing of roosters mingled with the lowing of cows, and the scent of damp earth brought a peace that only honest work can offer. Clara Ara walked between the rows of crops with a light heart. Joe followed close behind, inspecting the leaves, testing the soil, teaching the boys how to recognize the right time to harvest. The land seemed different, but in truth it was the same. What had changed were the hands that now touched it. With steady patience, Joe had taught the boys the value of waiting. Samuel had learned to trust nature's rhythm, Pedro to find joy in effort, and Elias, though still little, would already say that one day he'd be a man of the hoe. Just like Joe, Clara Ara watched all this with misty eyes. She had found more than a helper. She had found a mirror for her sons and a companion who shared life's silences. One morning, as they prepared lunch, Clara said, "You know, Joe, the land is a lot like us. It only bears fruit after many cuts, much rain, and a lot of sun," he replied, without taking his eyes off the pot. "And even then, sometimes the fruit takes a while. But when it comes, it's worth every bit of waiting." Time passed, and the harvest was generous. The corn grew tall, the chickens multiplied, and the well never ran dry again. The table, once bare, was now abundant, and on Sunday nights they all sat together to give thanks. Joe always began the prayer, "Lord, bless this home and this bread, and may we never lack the sweat of our labor, for it is what sustains us and gives us dignity." His simple words rang with power. and Clara felt in them something stronger than any memorized prayer. It was a living faith born from experience, shaped by pain, and rooted in hope. The boys were growing. Samuel now spoke of expanding the crops. Pedro dreamed of selling part of the harvest in the village. And Elias, curious as ever, asked questions about the world beyond the mountains. Joe encouraged them, but always reminded, "A real man isn't what he has. It's what he takes care of. And what you care for, God blesses." Those words became law in that house. Samuel, once closed off and suspicious, smiled more now. Pedro, always in a rush, had learned to wait. And Elias, the youngest, went to bed with dirty feet and a heart full of joy. One afternoon, Clara Ara and Joe sat beneath the blooming tree. The wind stirred the yellow blossoms, which fell to the ground like a blessing. "Joe, I never thought I'd see my boys growing up in peace like this," she said. "You planted that peace," he replied. "I only helped water it." Clara Ara smiled, but her eyes said otherwise. She knew that what Joe had brought couldn't be measured in chores. He'd brought presence, steadiness, comfort. The village, little by little, quieted its gossip. Now, when people spoke of Clara Ara's farm, it was with respect. They said the place was flourishing because God lived there. And maybe it was true. Maybe he really did live there, disguised in Joe's callous hands and Clara's quiet courage. One late afternoon, after another day of harvesting, Joe walked to the well and stood there, staring at his reflection in the water. The face he saw was no longer that of the lost man who had once wandered down that road. It was the face of someone who had found meaning. Clara Ara came and stood beside him, silent. "You know, Miss Clara," he said quietly, "the fire destroyed a lot in my life. But here I learned that work can also be a form of prayer, and one of the most beautiful," she replied. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in orange and gold. That sunset seemed to give thanks alongside them, because there, between the sweat and the silence, life had bloomed once again. And when night fell, with the scent of wild flowers and the distant sound of the river, Clara Ara knew with certainty the harvest time was not only of the land, it was of the soul. Everything planted with kindness. Sooner or later, destiny makes bloom. Time had settled on the farm like someone who finds rest after a long journey. Mornings passed peacefully. The boys grew strong, and the work bore fruit that filled both the table and the heart. Clara Ara, though often tired, wore the serene expression of someone who had learned to give thanks before asking. Joe bore the marks of time on his face, along with the quiet glow of gratitude. Life at last had found a rhythm of peace. But peace sometimes draws envy and temptation. It was on a market afternoon when Clara went down to the village to sell flour and eggs, that fate decided to test the firmness of her soul. Among the stalls and voices, an elegant man approached, dressed in a light suit and shiny new boots. It was Ottavio, the richest merchant in the region, owner of land, a general store, and a reputation as a smooth talker. He smiled when he saw her, Donna Clara Ara, still standing strong even after so many years of struggle. "You've got more courage than most men," he said, tipping his hat with false respect. "Courage is what you have left when there's no other choice," she replied, without lifting her eyes from the baskets. But Ottavio persisted. "I hear your farm's thriving now. They say you've got a man helping out. But look, Donna Clara, you deserve rest. I could give you comfort, a fine house, servants, new clothes. Don't you think you fought long enough?" Clara Ara looked up and met his eyes. There was something in his voice, a mix of promise and threat. "You may have all that, Mr. Ottavio. But what I have, no amount of money can buy." He chuckled, amused. "Pride, is that it?" "Dignity," she answered, "and that's the one thing I don't sell." She left him standing there and walked away, her heart uneasy. The afternoon breeze felt colder, and the weight of the village's stairs followed her every step. When she returned home, Jaw was in the yard sharpening a hoe. "Was the market day good?" he asked, not noticing what she carried in her soul. It was. but it seems the world never gets tired of testing us. She told him what had happened. Ju listened in silence, his expression serious. And what did you say? That I won't trade peace for wealth. He lowered his head, moved. I've seen many women accept gold out of fear of being alone. But not you, Clara sighed. I am afraid, Joe, but fear doesn't get to decide for me. That night, they lingered longer at the table. The boys talked excitedly about the harvest, and Clara watched Joe in silence. There was a calmness in him that comforted her. No luxury, no promise could replace the feeling of being beside someone who understood the value of work, of a word given, of faith. But Ottavio's words didn't fade easily. Days later, he showed up at the farm, riding a white horse, bringing fabric and sweets for the children. Clara greeted him in the yard, unsiling. I brought gifts, thought of the kids. My children don't need gifts. Mr. Ottavio, they need example. He tried to laugh, but his voice faltered. And is he that example? He asked, nodding toward Joe, who watched from a distance. Clara lifted her chin. Yes, he is. Ottavio fell silent. The stillness between the three was thick, like the air before a storm. Ju, who until then hadn't said a word, stepped forward and spoke calmly. You can take back what you brought. Respect can't be bought here. The merchant climbed back on his horse and left, wounded in pride. He never set foot on that path again. That night, Clara and Joe sat on the porch for a long time without speaking. The sky was clear, and the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. Finally she said, Now I know what peace is, Joe. It's not silence. It's not wealth. It's having someone who stays when everything else walks away. He looked at her with tenderness and humility. And that's why I stay. The stars seemed to shine brighter. Clara smiled, and her heart settled. The temptation had passed, leaving behind one undeniable truth. True love doesn't need promises, only presence, and in that humble home, where work filled the table and faith nourished the soul, Ju's presence was worth more than all the gold in the village. The years flowed like a river, winding silently between stones, unhurried but powerful. The farm, once poor and forgotten, was now full of life. The fruit trees had multiplied. The corral was always full, and the boys, now grown men, worked side by side with Joe. Samuel tended the crops. Pedro looked after the animals, and Elias, now with a steady voice and determined eyes, helped sell their harvest at the village market. Clara, her hair now silver, and her face gently lined with peaceful wrinkles, watched it all with a full heart. At times she would sit under the shade of the ipa tree and watch her son's work with the same strength and purpose of the man she had once found by the roadside. Joe, now with a white beard and slower steps, was still active. His hands, still steady, held the memory of labor. Every fence raised, every patch of land cultivated, carried his mark. One afternoon, the boys decided to surprise him. They worked in secret for days, sawing wood, raising walls, hammering tiles. Joe suspected something, but didn't ask. Until one bright morning, they called him out to the yard. There, standing beside the old house, was a new home, larger, solid, built by their own hands. Samuel, eyes glistening, spoke. Father, everything we know, we learned from you. This house is our way of saying thank you. Joe, caught off guard, tried to hide the emotion. Father, he echoed, his voice trembling. Elias stepped forward, smiling. Yes, you taught us what it means to be a man. Our blood may not be the same, but our love is. Joe brought his hands to his face and wept in silence. He wept like someone washing his soul, like someone who finally understood that fate had never abandoned him, only led him through rough roads to get here. Clara, standing at the door, had tears in her eyes too. She stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. God sent us a broken man to rebuild what fate had torn down. Joe looked up and found in her gaze the certainty of a lifetime. There was no more guilt, no more shame, no more loneliness, only peace. The village, once full of whispers, now respected him. They called him Mr. Ju Wang from New Farm, the man who made things bloom, that others thought lost. Many came to him for advice, others for help mending tools or fixing fences. He helped them all with his usual quiet demeanor, never boasting. To Clara Ara, he was the living proof that humility is the most beautiful form of greatness. In the late afternoons, the two would sit on the porch to watch the sunset. Ju didn't speak much, but that day he said something she would never forget. "You know, Miss Clara, when I first arrived here, I was just a tired man, the ashes of a fire. I thought I'd never be called father again, never have a place to return to at the end of the day. But you taught me that God doesn't forget those who still know how to give thanks." Clara held his hand and replied gently, "Life took much from me, Joe, but it gave back twice as much. Sometimes the blessing comes disguised as a cross." They sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the golden fields. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of flowers and the distant sound of chickens heading back to the coop. The new house glowed in the warm light of dusk. Not just a shelter, but a symbol of all they had built together. Not just walls, but a story. Later that evening around the table, Elias read a verse he had learned at church. "Those who sow in tears will reap in joy." Zhao smiled. "That's right, son. The land teaches what time confirms." That night, while the sky filled with stars, Clara Ara stood by the window, looking out at the old barn. She thought about everything they had lived through since the day she stopped the wagon on that road. It was there that it had all begun, and it was there, between dust and faith, that the quietest, truest love had taken root. Recognition, she realized, wasn't in the Ville's praise, or in the wealth they might have gained. It was in that rebuilt home, in the peace of her children, in the calm gaze of Joe. And as she turned off the lamp, she whispered, "God's justice never fails. It only takes the time needed to teach the heart how to understand." The IPA tree was covered in yellow blossoms when Joe realized that time had finally caught up with him. The hands that had once been steady now trembled when holding a hammer. The quick steps of his youth had grown slow. Still, he insisted on working, fixing what he could, as if movement were the last thread connecting him to the past. Clara watched him in silence, her gaze filled with the same tenderness and respect she'd had since the first day. She found him by the roadside. One calm afternoon, the sun was descending gently, and the wind whispered through the trees. Joa was in the yard, tending to an old fence. Suddenly he stopped, rested the hammer against the wood, and stared at the horizon. Deep in thought, Clara Ara appeared at the door, drying her hands on her apron. "Tire done?" she asked, her voice a blend of care and affection. He drew a deep breath and answered, his voice trembling. "Miss Clara, there's something I've carried inside me for a long time." She approached him slowly, sensing the weight of his words. Joe removed his hat, like a man letting go of a burden. "You gave me shelter, respect, and family. Gave me everything life had taken from me. There's only one thing missing now." "And what's that?" she asked, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. "A name." The silence that followed was more beautiful than any answer. Clara Ara lowered her eyes, and a tear slid down her weathered face. She stepped closer and replied softly, "Then take mine." Joe looked at her as if the world had come to a halt between them. The simplicity of her words carried the weight of a lifetime of redemption. He dropped to his knees, not out of habit, but out of reverence. He took her hands and said, "Only, may God make me worthy." The sons, watching from a distance, understood everything without needing explanation. Samuel ran to the village and called the pastor. Pedro tidied the yard. Elias, the youngest, gathered yellow IPA flowers and scattered them over the hard-packed earth. That evening, beneath the golden sky and the songs of birds, Clara and Joa were married right there in front of the home they had rebuilt together, under the blessing of simple living and the emotion of their children. The pastor read a verse that seemed written just for them. "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and better is patience than pride of spirit." Clara Ara and Joe looked into each other's eyes. In that exchange was everything time had failed to take: respect, tenderness, and deep companionship. There were no fancy dresses, no music, no grandists, but something greater was present: truth. After the ceremony, they all sat at the table. The meal was simple: rice, country chicken, flour, and the wine Elias had saved for special occasions. The boys' laughter filled the air, and Clara, from time to time, looked at Joa with the serenity of someone who had finally found what she was searching for. Peace. As night fell, Joe walked over to the IPA and laid a hand on its trunk. "When you called me from the road," he said, gazing at the falling blossoms, "I thought God had forgotten me. But now I know He was just waiting for me to be tired enough to understand the value of shelter." Clara stepped beside him and replied, "Sometimes God doesn't send miracles. He sends people." Joe B. smiled, and the wind blew strong, scattering golden petals around them. For a moment, it felt as though the sky itself bowed before a union built on humility and faith. That night, while everyone slept, Clara Ara remained awake, watching the man now sleeping peacefully at her side. The soft glow of the oil lamp lit Joe's serene face, and she realized that true love needs neither youth nor promises. It only needs to exist quiet, steady, and whole. Outside, the IPA was still in bloom. The petals fell slowly like blessings on the earth. And there, among the sound of crickets and the scent of soil, life whispered its lesson. Destiny may take its time, but it always comes for those who choose to love with a clean heart. Time passed like the wind crossing the mountains, at times gentle, at times strong, carrying away the old and sowing the new. Clara and Yu's home had become a resting place for travelers, wanderers, and weary souls. Anyone passing by could count on a hot meal, a kind word, and the shelter the world so often failed to give. There was no sign at the gate, but everyone knew the way. The farm had become more than a home. It was a refuge. Their sons grew up, married, and built their own homes nearby. And even with their own families, they all returned every Sunday to have lunch under the IPA tree. The long wooden table brought generations together. Clara Ara sat at the head, a white scarf covering her silver hair, her gaze lingering on each face, like someone witnessing a miracle. Joe beside her, quieter than ever, smiled with his eyes. One day, a weary traveler arrived from the road, a man with dirty hands and a worn-down look, just as Jew had once been. He asked only for a cup of water. Clara Ara invited him in, and as she served him bread, she said gently, "No one ends up here by accident." The man looked around confused and asked, "Aren't you afraid of letting strangers in?" Clara answered with the wisdom of someone who had seen life change course more than once. "I used to be when I thought the heart was a small house, but once I learned to open the doors, shelter was never lacking again." The traveler thanked her and went on his way. But before leaving, he looked up at the old IPA and said, "Whoever lives in a place like this lives within God's grace." After he left, Joe stood looking out at the horizon for a long while. The sun was already setting, and the IP's shadow stretched far across the land. He took Clara's hand, and they stood in silence. Sometimes there is nothing more to be said when everything has already been lived. The years folded gently over them. When Joe passed away on a quiet morning, the house was full of children, grandchildren, and neighbors. Clara held his hand, and with one final smile he whispered, "Thank you for the shelter." She didn't cry in that moment. She simply kissed his forehead and said softly, "Now it's God's turn to take care of you." And so time went on. Clara aged slowly with the peace of someone who knew life had fulfilled its course. She still welcomed travelers, and still told the same story of a man who came with nothing and left. Behind everything. One afternoon, one of her grandchildren asked, "Grandma, is it true Grandpa was a stranger when he first got here?" She smiled, looking up at the golden sky. He was, but the heart knows what God sends, even when it shows up disguised as exhaustion. And so, among laughter and memories, time remained faithful to that home. The old ipar still bloomed every year, scattering its yellow petals across the yard. They say that on windy nights you can hear the rustling flowers as if they were Joe's whisper, still watching over the house. Today, those who pass by and see the wagon resting beside the barn always ask about the story. And some say that when the sun sets and the smell of coffee fills the air, Clara Ara still appears on the porch, smiling the same white scarf, the same serene gaze, and when they ask her about life, she simply replies, "I gave him shelter, and he taught us how to live." Dot. And so, between love and labor, between faith and silence, that story became a testimony, not of grand miracles, but of the quiet power of kindness, the kind that saves without fanfare, heals without promise, welcomes without question, because in the end, that's what destiny came to prove. Love doesn't care about appearances, nor does it arrive on schedule. It only needs a heart willing to open the door. And Clara Ara, the woman who once reached out to a weary man, discovered that sometimes offering shelter is the same as finding home. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our